Good morning. I'm Dwight Keene. I'm chair of the Kansas Corporation Commission. I'm joined this morning by fellow Commissioners Susan Duffy and Commissioner Andrew French. At this time, I'll call to order this meeting of the Kansas Corporation Commission on this Tuesday, November 29th, 2022. Commissioners, the first matter for our consideration this morning are 9 items on the consent agenda. We've had the opportunity to review the contents of the orders in each of these matters. So I would turn to each of you and ask if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. And I'll begin with Commissioner Duffy.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I have no questions or comments.
Thank you. Commissioner French.
Good morning. No comments. I move approval of the consent agenda.
I second the motion.
Been moved and seconded, we approve the consent agenda. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Aye. Motion carries. The consent agenda is approved. The next matter on our agenda this morning is a discussion item. It involves the quarterly update on activities with the Southwest Power Pool, our grid operator. Our presenter this morning is former KCC chair and our SPP working group consultant, Sherry Feist Albrecht. Sherry, good morning. And your screen share is working, for the record.
But you're muted.
Okay,
That's better. Okay.
there
Good
we
morning,
go. Good morning. I apologize.
No problem. Well, we're going to turn it over to you. So please, without further ado.
Right. Well,
proceed.
it's that time again to update you on the quarterly SPP meetings, which were completed on October 24th and October 25th for the joint stakeholder and SPP board members committee meetings. So I will just go to the next slide. The RSC business meeting was preceded in the morning by an education session, which primarily took up some education on one of the resource adequacy policies that I will be discussing later. But for the business meeting, there were several voting items. One was the annual RSC audit. The 2021 audit was reviewed. There were no findings, and the RSC commissioners adopted that audit report. There was an election of the 2023 officers. Incoming president will be Commissioner French. Incoming vice president will be Commissioner Huser from the Iowa Board of Utilities. And the secretary for 2023 will be Commissioner Will McAdams from Texas. The other item that was voted on was a business practice 7060. And the revision request there, it simply clarifies the oversight role of the project cost working group to include projects required for transmission service where the cost is 100% directly assigned to one or more transmission customers who is not the designated transmission owner. It was approved unanimously both by COG and by the RSC. Without, I don't believe, any discussion at all. Then the big lift for the RSC at the business meeting were the resource adequacy policies, and we had a number of them. Revision request 499 has to do with the planning criteria testing requirements. For those testing requirements have been in place for 16 years without much adjustment. And so it goes through and updates the planning criteria or the testing requirements for a variety of resources. That was a non-controversial revision request. It was something I believe most people thought was long overdue. It went through all the stakeholder processes without much of a hitch at all. And the RSC did approve it unanimously. We also covered the deliverable capacity for the winter season, the planning reserve margin increase, and the waiver process. And I always get ahead of myself on these because I go into the detail of each of these on later slides. So at the RSC business meeting, we also, in addition to that, had some reports from the cost allocation work group from the regional cost allocation review process for the report number 3. And then the Seams Liaison Committee had a rate pancaking update for the commissioners. And here are those planning criteria testing requirements that I just covered. So I'll skip past that slide. And the deliverable capacity for the winter season is revision request 508. It revises attachment AA of the SPP tariff. And currently, the load responsible entities are able to use deliverable capacity as determined by deliverability study for the summer season only. And so this would extend the use of that deliverable capacity to the winter season resource adequacy obligation. That was also a non-controversial revision request through, I believe, all of the stakeholder processes, and the RSC did approve it unanimously. The planning.
Real quick,
Go ahead.
Sherry, when you
Sure.
say new capability testing requirements, are we talking about quantity or quality of the testing, of the new testing requirement? Is it
The
more-
testing, the testing results are used to, as part of the resource adequacy assessment process. And so they are operating criteria, it's operating criteria. So it's evaluating their ability to meet the test to qualify for accreditation.
to meet the test to qualify for accreditation?
So
Okay,
it's testing the capability of those resources to supply to meet the capacity requirements for the system as a whole.
and
So I would call it, I would say it's both qualitative and quantitative.
okay, so it's also all forms of energy where
Yes,
okay,
yes,
okay,
yes.
all right, real good. And real quick, on the audit, when you say RSC audit, is that a financial audit or is that an
Yes.
operational audit?
It's a financial audit.
Okay, all right, very good. Okay, thank you.
Sure. With regard to revision request 516, the planning reserve margin increase was approved in the July round of meetings. This is the revision request that puts that in place. And it would make a change to the planning criteria. It's not a tariff change, it's a planning criteria change. And so this would go into those planning criteria, and the increase is from 12% to 15% beginning with the 2023 summer season. And it was approved unanimously.
So no brouhaha with that. It was
Not with,
approved.
yeah, not with that one. I mean, it didn't have a unanimous votes, I don't think necessarily coming through the stakeholder groups, although it was virtually unanimous, because there was a recognition that the loss of load expectations study did show that there was a reliability concern, a justifiable reliability concern.
Right.
So it really didn't meet with all that much opposition. Now, there was some question whether or not that increase should be in the tariff. But this revision request would simply revise it to the planning criteria to include it. And I believe it went into effect November 1st.
Okay,
So let's see. I'm on the deficiency payment waiver. This was the most controversial of the resource adequacy policies that was up for consideration by the RSC. Several of the working groups, what this does is it would revise, currently the tariff has a provision that puts a deficiency payment in place for any load responsible entity who fails to meet the the resource adequacy requirement for the summer season. And it's calculated by taking the amount of the capacity that load responsible entity is deficient. It multiplies it by the cost of new entry, which, if I recall correctly, that number is around $86,000. I don't know if that's correct offhand. And then it multiplies it by a cone factor, which kind of relates back. It's a multiplier that relates back to the sufficiency of the system as a whole. And different percentages would require upping that cone factor. So if they're deficient right now under the tariff, there you make this payment. So one of the concerns that arose out of the discussion related to the increase in the planning reserve margin was the short notice that the stakeholders are operating under with regard to making sure that they are not going to be deficient come June 1st of 2023. So one of the concerns was with the adoption of the reserve with the planning reserve margin was we need to do something to address this penalty, so that people aren't caught off guard because of the short notice on the increase. So what this does is it would provide a process for seeking a waiver for those who may not have sufficient capacity to meet that for the 2020, that planning reserve margin requirement for the 2023 summer season. The proposal that passed it's based on the market monitoring unit proposal, which was based on what COG approved. It establishes a resource adequacy capacity bulletin board, which would basically publicly allow the posting of requests to buy and offers to sell capacity within SPP, so that it provides an avenue to match buyers and sellers, and in an effort to avoid having to be short for the upcoming season. Then it would establish a one-time waiver of that deficiency payment for up to 2 years if those load responsible entities meet the eligibility criteria that are set out in this waiver provision. Those would require standard contract terms, including product price cap and/or floor for bulletin board to ensure transparency, feasibility, and objectivity. And the idea is for those who are short to put forth their best efforts and have a plan for curing their deficiency. So the bulletin board is sort of designed to put that in place, to show that there's been some planning effort by those entities that are short on capacity. And so the contract terms would go along with that, offers to buy and requests to buy and offers to sell. And then it conditions the waiver so that the load responsible entities only qualify for the waiver if there's not sufficient capacity available on the bulletin board, and only on the portion of the deficiency that couldn't be reasonably covered. Let's say they're 100 megawatts short. And they need, and of that 100, maybe they can purchase 20. So they're going to be ultimately short for the 80. Well, the waiver would cover the 20 that they're able to cover from the bulletin board, then they would be short for the other 80. And the LREs, like I said earlier, have to have a plan for curing that deficiency. And it would update some of the deadlines. That we have some soft deadlines in the resource adequacy process that would allow some, and by soft deadlines, I mean they're not necessarily dictated by the tariff, but more by an operational practice that would allow them more time to cure a deficiency and request an exemption. Whoops, I went too far. So there were part of the reason for the education session at the RSC is that there were a number of waiver proposals. SOG, the Supply Adequacy Working Group, who is the primary group within SPP that works on resource adequacy issues, had put together a proposal, which was ultimately approved by the Markets and Operations Policy Committee. But the Cost Allocation Working Group offered up a different proposal. It modified the SOG proposal. And then the SPP Market Monitoring Unit also offered a proposal, which I just discussed, and which was ultimately adopted by a majority of the RSC. Commissioner French offered up an alternative, as did the Texas commissioner on the RSC. And ultimately, the RSC did approve the MMU's proposal. And as you see, there are three RSC members opposed: Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. And I think that's the last slide I have on resource adequacy. So if anybody has a question, now would be a good time.
Yes, I do. So Commissioner French, can you explain what you offered up and in as an alternative?
So I thought that question might be coming, and it's a good question because I think probably my position was a bit different than the opposition from Oklahoma and Texas. Sherry, if you could go back to the previous slide, maybe, or maybe I can just describe. So what passed, and let me say I don't have a lot of heartburn with the waiver process that passed, is essentially that it's got two big prongs that someone would have to meet. And if they meet those two big prongs, then their deficiency payment obligation is totally wiped out. And the two pieces are they have to show that there is no generation capacity available to purchase in the short term by reference to a bulletin board that's going to be publicly made available. And then they have to show that they have a contracted obligation to purchase capacity over the next couple of years to get themselves compliant, or they've got a spot in the queue to build their own capacity to get themselves compliant. Essentially, the feedback we got from almost universally from the stakeholder groups and transmission owners, load serving entities, was that it was going to be almost impossible to demonstrate both of those items, particularly maybe for some of the smaller entities. They just didn't think anybody would be able to qualify for the waiver if they had to meet both of those prongs. And so, there was a concern that we're creating a waiver process that maybe nobody could qualify for. And so, that was a concern to me of, why are we creating a waiver or providing some sort of relief that maybe nobody could demonstrate that they qualify for. Now, on the other side of that, I had some heartburn about the fact that we were completely waiving the entire deficiency payment. I mean, it's part of that payment is, I would say, is a penalty for being short on capacity. But part of that is also just a recognition that if you are short, you are relying on the extra capacity that others in the region are carrying. And so it is really just a remedy for perhaps what one would call a subsidy. And I and staff, I think, had some concerns about completely waiving that payment. And so I will tell you what I proposed as an alternative was that we would remove the bulletin board prong and we would focus, put more of our focus on the requirement that you show us what is your plan in the next 2 to 3 years to get additional capacity, either by contracting with somebody who has extra capacity or by building your own to get to that 15%, and put all of the focus on what someone's actual plan is. But then the counterbalance to making it easier perhaps to qualify for the waiver is that I proposed to, I guess, lessen the financial implications, and what I had proposed was to remove what we call the multiplier. So folks could not get the entire deficiency payment waived. They would still have to pay sort of the cost of new entry of a new generation plant, but they wouldn't have to pay the multiplier, or what I would view as the penalty portion of that piece, if they can show that they have a plan to become compliant in the future. And so, that was my alternative proposal. I wouldn't say it got a lot of discussion. I mean, I sort of felt like the discussion in our meeting was pretty rushed. Even though I don't think we had to approve any sort of waiver in this meeting, we could have waited another meeting. There was a majority that wanted to move forward and get something approved. like I said, I don't have a lot of heartburn with what was approved, but my opposition came from the fact that I thought there were maybe better alternatives that could have been considered. I thought there was more time for discussion, and so ultimately, I didn't agree with the process of just moving forward with what we had in front of us right away, and that was the area of my no vote.
Okay, so the bulletin board, so you weren't opposed to the bulletin board?
Not in concept.
In the short
I made some
term?
comments that I think that's something that didn't necessarily need to be put in the tariff. It's something that voluntarily SPP could have facilitated and made happen. They could have put it on their website, but I would not have included it as part of the requirement to get the waiver.
Well, isn't that, I mean, wouldn't
So
that be the first action of an entity is to go out to the bulletin board and if they were short and get what they need? And isn't this still just a stopgap measure until entities are up to the 15%?
Yeah, so the bulletin board was one of the two prongs, and that was actually the piece that I would have removed.
Okay, all right.
The piece that I would have kept was, what are you actually doing in a little longer term? The bulletin board really was a stopgap. It was, are there little scraps of capacity available? And if there are, and people put them on the bulletin board, then we're not going to let somebody get a waiver unless they're showing that, I guess they have to show that there aren't anything on the bulletin board. But that was the piece that I would have scrapped, and I would have focused more on the second prong, which is, have you gotten capacity under contract for the next couple of years, or have you got a place in the generator interconnection queue to get something built that's going to get you compliant over the next couple of years? And I think the reason I focused more on that prong is I'm interested in people making good longer term planning decisions. What are you doing for the long term to get compliant?
Okay, it just seems common sense to me that if somebody has extra capacity, they're already letting other entities know, hey, I've got some over here. If looks like cold weather's moving in, if you guys need it, give a holler, we're good. I mean, I would think that kind of discussion's already behind the scenes is already going on. That would make the most efficient use of everyone's resources then.
It's a good comment, and I can tell you the updates we've received is that is happening.
Okay.
As entities are realizing that they are maybe long on capacity, there is trading of that capacity going on.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner French, I appreciate, first of all, congratulations on your ascension to the head of the RSC.
Thank you.
I appreciate the nuanced response that you just provided to Commissioner Duffy. Let's go back up to 30,000 feet again. Given the deficiency payment waiver policy that has now been adopted, in your opinion, what are the major downsides to that?
Well,
the risks, what are the risks?
I don't know that there are any giant risks associated with what was approved. I mean, I think that it is a balancing of trying to recognize that there are going to be some entities caught short on capacity, that there was sort of a confluence of events. The reserve margin was increased from 12 to 15% in a pretty brief period of time. And at the same time, we were also making changes to how we were accrediting both renewable resources and traditional resources, and the confluence of all those events. I think there's a good argument that perhaps through no malfeasance or bad behavior, some entities were going to be caught short, and it would be unfair to be punitive to them at that time. And so the concept of a waiver, I don't have a lot of concern with. I do have some concern with the signal that we are sending, that we are running into a position right now of really tightening reserves of capacity across our entire region. Capacity is at a premium, and we need more of it. And I do have a concern that, what is the signal we're sending that as soon as we start to get close on our planning reserves, we start to diminish the financial incentives or penalties for people to maintain those reserves. So I would say I don't think it's necessarily creating a big risk. This policy in and of itself is creating a big risk, but I do have a little bit of concern about the signal it sends, about the need to maintain more capacity and build capacity in our region as we have tightening reserves. And so, I would like to see more focus on a framework that if we need more and new generation in our footprint, what's the plan to get there? And make sure that it's generation that has the right attributes to make sure that we can reliably serve existing load and new load. We don't want to be turning down opportunities for economic development and bring more people into the region because we have tightening generation reserves. So that gives you a little bit of insight into where my mind's at right now. So a little bit of a concern with maybe the signal that this sends, but not that big. My focus is on proactively making sure that we're setting up the right framework for the future to make sure we have what we need.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that response and all the nuances associated with it. Let me follow up by asking this. I'm going to ask you a really leading question here, my friend. Does this incentivize over-reliance on those states that have more resilience and reliability derived from thermal generating capacity?
I think what it does is, in the short run, I don't know if I would think about it as far as thermal or not thermal. I would say in the short run, we're probably going to be relying on states that took a more conservative approach to the planning reserve margin. There are, and I'm not going to name names. there are certainly load serving entities that cut things closer, that carried 12.5% reserves, and there are other states and load serving entities that carried much higher reserves. Now, I want to temper any judgment though, because as I said, when we increased the reserve margin and when we changed how we accredited both renewable resources and traditional resources all at once, I think even some entities that thought they were taking a more conservative approach, things are tightening for them. Things are tightening across the entire region. So yes, I do think there is going to be more reliance on states and load serving entities that took a more conservative approach. I think it's appropriate for those entities to receive some compensation. That's why I was probably not very comfortable with the idea of a full waiver of this deficiency payment, because to me, that is a compensation for a subsidy that may exist. Now, granted, I don't know that it's real likely anybody's going to qualify for this waiver, but that's why I had some concern with that. So I may not put it in terms of thermal generation or traditional generation, but I certainly would put it in terms of who took a more conservative approach to their planning reserve margin. And obviously, you can take it for what it will, that different types of generation are going to have different accreditation percents, and they're going to have different attributes. And so, I won't posit, what the message is for different types of generation, but I certainly would say, as far as a percent of reserve margin, you are seeing more reliance on those that took a more conservative approach.
Well, thank you for that. The essence of my concern is really quite simple. We have a diversity of approaches to baseload mixes from all the different states that comprise the SPP. And now the SPP is reaching out, they're looking west. We've got Manitoba. This thing is almost exponentially becoming more complicated, at least in my view. And so I'm concerned about maybe the incompatibility with trying to reach maybe very difficult to reach or impossible to reach, as it turns out after the fact, generation mix decisions, and therefore a reliance on, as you suggest, those states that have been more conservative in their approach. That's my concern.
Yeah, I think it's a great observation. I think we are all going to put a premium on reliable generation with, as I said, the term I like right now, which you're starting to hear a lot at SPP, is generation that has the right attributes. Is it flexible? Is it available and dispatchable when you need it? Now that can mean a wide range of things. That could mean, gas, it can mean coal, it could be solar with storage attached to it. But we need to make sure we have a mix that keeps the light on, and we need to make sure we have enough of it. That's not a conversation we've had to have a lot in the past. In fact, it's probably the total opposite of the conversation we've had to have in the past, where we had so much excess generation. But it's going to be a really, really important conversation coming up. We don't want to see generation move out of our region. And we probably, frankly, are going to have difficult conversations about whether we add generating capacity and how much we add, and what type we add.
I believe here in Kansas, where all legs of the stool are needed, all forms of energy, I think, the bottom line is we have an abundance of wind, we have an abundance of sun that should become solar generation, but we also have already existing plants and resources that we need to use until the technology gets to a point where it's dispatchable, affordable, and reliable. And we're not quite there. But here's my question. Doesn't some of this depend too on future membership in SPP? One, I don't understand those states that have split between MISO and SPP. I've just got to believe that's mind-boggling to deal with two different entities in the same state. I just don't see the rationale there. I'm sure there is one that I just do not understand. But doesn't part of our future depend on, resource capacity could be adjusted too by new membership coming into the SPP? And I don't know if where we are on new members, if that's like the first of the year of next year, whatever, but isn't that part of the equation as well?
Yeah, I think if we're talking about the West, most of those are going to be in the Western Interconnect. And for the most part, my perspective is, reliability is going to be pretty much separate in between the two, although I would certainly like to see other states and entities that share, our value for reliability. I also want to go back to something you said about the different types of generation sources and make sure that I make clear, this is a nuance, but it's a really important nuance that I think gets lost a lot of times. There's a difference between energy and capacity. And, you may generate a lot of your energy from certain types of sources. Maybe those are wind and solar that are cheap and they're available much of the time. But that's maybe different than capacity and capacity accreditation. And so, I'm not making any comments here about preferences for one or the other, but they have different attributes, and we need to make sure we have both of them. We want clean, affordable energy, and we want to dispatch, the lowest cost energy whenever it's available. But as far as capacity, the ability to turn something on and know that it's there at any particular time, that's really what we're talking about when we talk about resource adequacy. And so when we talk about the full generation mix and planning for the future, as Chair Keen brought up as well, we need to make sure we take into account both energy sufficiency and resource adequacy, reliability associated with the amount of capacity we have.
So how quickly will we know if entities are up to the 15% and they're accredited? How is that going to happen over a period of time, or is that, how does that actually occur?
Sherry may be able to correct me here, but I think all the entities' workbooks are due to SPP in mid-February. And then SPP puts out a resource adequacy report in, I think it usually gets published around June. And that gives you a nice snapshot, a lot of great graphs of where every entity is. So it'll tell you if they're short, it'll tell you if they're very close to the margin. We'll be able to see for all of our entities in Kansas exactly where they are, but we'll also be able to see, where everybody in the footprint is.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, you got the dates right. I think it's February 15th that the workbooks are due, and by the 15th of May, if there are any corrections or updates that an entity needs to make, they've got to have it done by then so that they can make the report available June 1st.
And I would imagine if any of our entities are short, we'll hear about it well before June, well before anything is published.
Informally, I've heard that for summer 2023, I think everybody's okay.
I've heard the same.
It's 2024 that's what's got everybody's attention for the time being. Okay. I'm going to try to advance this slide, maybe. All right. One added note I will make to this RR 515. Part of the reason it came into being is because both the RSC and the board had concerns about the timing of the planning reserve margin. And that was an action item, I think, that was made by both organizations to see what SPP staff could come up with in terms of a possible deficiency mitigation plan. So this was the result of that plan. But since it has been adopted, and the way the board handled this at the meetings in October was just to say they directed SPP staff to make the RSC filing at FERC. They didn't really weigh in on the merits of this particular waiver policy, but there was enough concern, I think, that's been kind of generated that SPP staff has created a strike team, which is composed of stakeholders and commissioners, as well as the market monitor, and I believe a board member or two. And what they're looking at is one aspect of the market monitor's proposal was a deficiency payment curve that might
You've frozen up, Sherry.
which may or may not develop into a separate revision request. And so that work is ongoing. I think that strike team, as they are called, they're advisory only. They don't have any ability to make any decision. They're looking at a lot of data. They're looking at kind of how to fill the short-term gap in terms of those deficiency payments. And what that amount ought to be. It may or may not result in any change to the waiver that's been approved. I think SPP they're proceeding to file the tariff as the tariff filing as requested by the board. But just know that the board does meet in early December. I don't know whether this issue will, I think there might be an issue. It may be addressed in some fashion then. I don't really know. I know that Commissioner French is a member of that strike team. I don't want to put him on the spot, but I wanted to let you all know that there's still some background work going on, particularly with regard to the deficiency payment curve and how to calculate that. The reports that we took, there was a COG report, and there's really not much for me to say about the COG report because it was essentially all of these resource adequacy policies, because that's mostly what we've been working on for the last quarter. There was a regional allocation review task force. I believe I reported last time that they were nearing completion of the report. They were still gathering a little bit of data since that time. This is a review slide just to refresh your recollection of kind of what that process is. But the study has now been completed, and it took the operations-based study approach. So it used the daily market runs and then removed the transmission upgrades in a subsequent run to try to capture the value that the removed transmission provided to the SPP region. The results of the study, by and large, show, which I think was indicated last time before we had the final data in, that there's a significant benefit to cost results, the ratio results for the SPP region and for all of the SPP pricing zones. Now, there are a couple of members who went from below the 0.8 benefit to cost ratio kind of minimum to well above, I think 100 times above, 100 times higher or whatever than what it was before. So there are concerns there about some of those results. And so that's kind of what bullet 3 is getting at. And so the report is remaining open, and RTF will have, they're going to continue to work with stakeholders. They have a meeting coming up, I think Monday of next week. So whether or not that report will be further tweaked to include some of those comments or raise those issues, or whether they'll be developed more fully in the lessons learned report that is always developed following an RCAR report, remains to be seen. But I just thought I'd bring you up to speed on kind of everybody is looking good. And what that does is, as you recall, is evaluates the highway byway cost allocation methodology and the results across the region. So
basically we're looking good in the state of Kansas, right?
Yeah, we're looking good all across.
Okay. All right, good.
The footprint.
All right.
Yeah, at least from the numbers that are included in the study right now, it is showing, a very good cost to benefit ratio for all of our zones. I mean, you're probably looking at something around 3 or 4, which is a good cost benefit in the western part of the state. And you're looking at things more in the range of 7 to 12 in the eastern part of the state, which is honestly a pretty amazing cost benefit. The concern, as Sherry mentioned, is I think those results are somewhat intuitive in the sense that you would expect, more transmission, moving lower cost energy from the western part of the state to the eastern part of the state and moving it around within the western part of the state to be a benefit to the west and a major benefit to the east. The folks that have questions are, there is a zone in southeast Kansas. It's the Empire zone. And then there's also City Utilities Springfield, which is in the same area, but in Missouri. We quite frankly, we discussed this issue tangentially in a recent Empire rate case, that they continue to see fairly high locational marginal prices in their zone. And that is the basis of them questioning, whether they are receiving enough benefit from the transmission build out. I think as Sherry mentioned, they went from having something like a 0.8 benefit cost in the last one of these reports to an 8.0. and I think they are finding that result a bit hard to believe. And it, to be quite frank, I mean, from my perspective, it's not real intuitive when you continue to see the congestion that they face. And so I would just, I have encouraged SPP to continue looking at the results and to work with Empire to try to understand where the disconnect may be there, if there is one.
All right, ready to move to the next slide? Okay. The SEAMS Liaison Committee has come up with rate pancaking work group recommendations. I'm pretty sure I've covered these before, but it's continuing the work on rate pancaking. There's a value to be seen by that continued work. I believe that both the RSC and the organization of MISO states, the RSC counterpart for MISO, both agree that this work needs to continue. And most of this has to do with RTOs performing some additional work on these rate pancaking issues and looking at ways to maybe reduce some of the rate pancaking, and just to get a better understanding of some of the processes that exist within each RTO in terms of congestion hedges, and then looking at, could it be completely eliminated? Could there be for example, a long-term interregional rate that could be developed that would work across all of these issues? And then, there are just other things to take a look at, and so a lot of this is still going to be continued data gathering, looking towards a solution. And so that work is ongoing, but both RSC and OMS have essentially operated under consensus to advance this work forward. So SEAMS Liaison Committee, I think there will be some changes maybe to the SPP side of the representation in terms of Commissioner Murphy in Oklahoma. I believe it will be leaving the commission in maybe in January. And I think, as I recall, if I recall correctly, Commissioner Chuck Hutchison from Nebraska will be kind of filling that spot. And like Ted Thomas also recently left. So I'm not sure, I don't recall if there was a mention of who replaces him, but there's a little bit of change on the SPP side in terms of commissioner representation. The joint stakeholder briefing, there's no action taken. This is just an opportunity for SPP staff not to have to make the same representations twice. And so we get a FERC update here. Usually these are pretty standard agenda items for the briefing. And then that was followed by the SPP board and members committee. And their voting items included approving their 2023 operating budget and capital budget. And I show there the total expenses, the net revenue requirement, and then their capital budget. And as I recall, I think this budget might have been slightly below what it was for 2022. They also approved the 2022 ITP plan and the associated assessment report that goes along with it. It's required as part of the tariff that they show that they approve that to document that they've completed the ITP planning process for 2022. And then they authorized, as I mentioned earlier, the filing of the revision request for the waiver process. Then they had a number of consent agenda items. They had a couple of new SPP board directors that were nominated and approved. And then they had, some changes for committee memberships, either chairpersons or maybe members of committees that they approved. Some of the notices to construct have been withdrawn or slightly modified, or there was a cost increase or something was suspended. There was a number of little staff reports that kind of go along with each one of those, and those were all approved. They approved the revision requests, and as I've mentioned before, you're familiar with 508, 516, and 499. Our 514 has to do, that's an operations, it came out of, I think it originated probably with the ORWG, the operating reliability working group. It's a violation relaxation limits, and it's an annual analysis. It evaluates to what extent any NERC requirements might have been, or not so much violations, but some of the actual ability to relax some of those limits, and what the status is of those potential violations across the footprint. 512 and 520. 512 has to do with reporting accredited behind the meter generation, and 520 is a similar revision request, but reporting on non-registered accredited demand response. 512 and 520 are both IRATF, and satisfy our IRATF initiatives to get better information regarding behind the meter generation and demand response resources, so that we have a better view of what capacity is out there. So that was the essence of the board meeting. The FERC update included HIT C2. HIT C2, well, this actually happened after the meeting, but October 28th, the FERC approved the HIT C2 waiver. And SPP did make the required compliance filing on November 16th. There were 2 dissents to that filing. Commissioners Christie and Danley dissented. But that, I think that the effective date for that was August 1st of 2022. And then regarding Order 2222, SPP did have a deficiency letter that they received on August 12th, and SPP has since filed its response on October 12th. No word yet from FERC on the status of that response. FERC also approved on November 1st the SPP bylaws revision. I think I spoke to you about this maybe back in April. We revised the RSC bylaws to clearly identify that only state utility commissions and boards within SPP RTO footprint are eligible for membership on the RSC, which necessitated a similar change to the SPP bylaws, which the board approved, and so that was also approved by FERC, and I think the new RSC bylaws are on the RSC website. HIT M1 congestion hedging. This is another issue. It's been permeating the conversation through working groups. I believe since the HIT M1 initiative was in 2019, but it's been talked about ever since then, struggling to figure out how to deal with this, because it was originally set out to implement a counterflow optimization. And over the course of time, it has sort of evolved into a little bit more generic, not so narrowly crafted to that counterflow optimization. So as I note here on this second bullet, in April, the board kind of set a time frame. They wanted this to be resolved by year end. Staff had a workshop, a HIT M1 workshop in September, going through all of that, had panel discussions involving stakeholders. And so now we're going through education processes, both at RSCOG and RSC. The SPP staff has come forward with a proposal. I think there are five identified recommendations within that proposal. And the whole idea is to try to long-term transmission congestion rights were awarded, several years ago. And they were set up to kind of be in place. The intent was to keep them in place there was no time frame on it. But once they're granted, I think there was a feeling that there was some inequity in the process because maybe some of the other new entities coming into the footprint or others, it's been likened to having an all-you-can-eat buffet and having some of the first ones served go through multiple times before some of the later or the smaller entities get one chance at the buffet. So they're trying to fix what they are perceived inequities and fairness in that awards process, to take a look at maybe increasing those awards and to take a hybrid approach that maybe aligns some transmission and market models that haven't necessarily figured into the equation previous to this. So it's undergoing a lot of education and review process in the various working groups. SPP staff has targeted January 2023 quarterly meetings for action on the proposal. So the staff recommends resetting those LTC awards every 10 years. So they wouldn't go on forever. They would be reset every 10 years to give more opportunities for participants to receive those. And there are, I believe, 3 rounds in the whole process. And this second bullet they would modify the round 2 nomination capacity from 100% to an incremental percentage up to 100%, so that kind of gives more participants an opportunity to have a bite at that apple. And then it would modify the capacity calculation for round 1 of the auction revenue rights process for a more equitable allocation of those auction revenue rights. It would also modify that round 1 nomination capacity from 50% to an incremental percentage up to 50%. And then the final piece of this is to take a look at the distribution of excess auction revenues. How are they distributed across the those who are participating or not participating in this process? Whoops, I need to go back. So what we've heard so far is that most of the stakeholders are in line or in tune, don't have much opposition to the middle 3 modification bullets here on this slide. The 2 biggest, and probably the number 1 concern, is this resetting the long-term congestion right awards to 10 years. There's some concern about, well, for example, nuclear plants and their high capacity factors, and whether or not they should have some, I don't know if preference is the right word, but if the criteria should, they should have some special consideration given the award, these awards, that's offset by those who don't get any, so right now there's nothing. It would just reset this every 10 years. And the 10 years comes from, I believe there's a FERC order that addresses long-term congestion rights, and it would set 10 years as a minimum. So that's where that 10 years comes from. And so they're trying to sort through all of this. There's ongoing education in several of the working groups. And I don't know if we're going to make the January 2023, because at the last COG meeting, I do know that SPP staff indicated that the distribution of excess auction revenues was going to require some more detailed work that needed to be done. I don't know what the time frame was for getting that work done. I think they're still aiming for the January 2023 timeframe, but I don't know how much work that involves. So that's kind of where that is. This is a confusing topic for me. This is something that I think if you have questions about the details, I would certainly offer that I'd be happy to sit down with you, and Chad Unrein would probably be a great person to help with the understanding of this, because this is a difficult process to explain for me anyway.
You're not alone.
So I will leave. Well, did I skip a slide now? No, okay, I'm good. So here's where we are with the IRATF winter weather update. We are nearly halfway through the initiatives that we have. We've got 10 completed as of really October. We did not meet in September to give, I think there was some ongoing work with those reliability attributes that SPP staff will come back to us with in the December meeting. So we're hoping to get half of those completed by the end of this year. But so we've there's going to be a new annual evaluation of resource availability that SPP will do. And that's been approved. We've approved capacity being offered into the market by accredited resources, reporting accredited behind the meter generation. That's that RR 512. Generation retirement evaluation and process improvement. We're still working on, we've approved the scope statement for that. And kind of going along with that is this compensation mechanism to address generator retirement. So the initiatives are complete. We've approved those. And so now some of the work is still ongoing to get those things in process for further discussion. IRATF is continuing its work on the gas electric coordination, and they're working on several initiatives related to the LOLE study, including fuel supply limitations, seasonal LOLE studies, and seasonal characteristics of outages. I was just reviewing my SOG notes from earlier this month, and those things are all they're the expert working group on those issues. They were all topics of discussion at the meeting earlier this month, and they will continue discussion of those into December. JT,
real quick.
Sure. Before we move on, I'd like to go back to that slide if we can, the previous one on the winter update. Okay. Let me ask a couple of questions kind of tangential to this. Earlier this month, NERC released its 2022-2023 winter reliability assessment report. And I want to just read a couple of lines, a couple of parts of that very succinctly. Under key findings, the report finds that a large portion of the North American bulk power system is at risk for insufficient electricity supplies during the peak winter conditions. It says higher peak demand projections, inadequate generator weatherization, fuel supply risks, and natural gas infrastructure are contributing to risks seen in the following areas. And then it goes specifically into each of these specific areas. With respect to the area we're in with SPP, and I'm reading here again from page 5 of the report, it says that the 3 areas hit hardest by the 2021 winter storm Uri, that's Texas, the ERCOT, SPP, and MISO, have implemented several improvements based upon their operating experience. In SPP, where winter storm Uri impacts were less severe, that means relative to Texas, I think. We think they were pretty severe here. We still bear the brunt of that, and we live in the wake of it, obviously. But it goes on to say, a focus on operational coordination and situational awareness is intended to help operators ensure that sufficient resources are available for extreme conditions. And then back, my final quote here is on page 25. This is under the section specifically dedicated to SPP. It says SPP planning reserves are adequate for the upcoming winter season. Since the 2021-2022 winter, SPP has added 3,700 megawatts of natural gas fired generation. It goes on to say SPP does not anticipate any emerging reliability issues impacting the area for the 2022-2023 winter season, but realizes that interruptions to fuel supply could create, unique operational challenges. My only reason for actually quoting that, and because I think that NERC report was eye-opening, I'll put it that way, and certainly in some areas throughout the country, very concerning. But this last bullet point that we have, you've provided here, I think is so important, because that communication and coordination on the gas electric, I think, was a major contributor to the outcome that we had in 2021. So I think it's heartening to the question I was going to ask if you hadn't presented it, and you have, was, given all of the goals that were set in the wake of Uri, where are we? And you set that out pretty specifically here. I think that's helpful. And I think, I guess you're convinced that the other initiatives are really going to be completed within the next month, basically. Am I hearing that right?
Well, no, 10 of 25. So 2 more, halfway is what, 12, 13?
Right.
So some of the other, we'll be about halfway through these 25 initiatives. And then some of them had longer timeframes well, I don't know if implementation is the right word, but for us to take a look at and approve the work going forward on. I think all of them have been started. And I think they're in various stages on the design, the design piece of those policy decisions. So I think, as I recall, of those, I think they were hoping to have all those completed by the beginning of 2024. So we have another year's worth of work to go. They've tried to hit most of the ones that affect the 2022, 2023 winter season up front. They've worked on force majeure language, and they're working with NASB on some of that. I know they've been meeting with some of the gas counterparts and how to coordinate that. I know that the Operating Reliability Working Group is working on some of those NERC initiatives to develop, what are the load shed plans? What's critical gas infrastructure? How do you know what it is? How do you prioritize it in terms of that? So that work is currently ongoing within the Operating Reliability Working Group, which is the one that's primarily responsible and takes a look at SPP compliance with NERC from an operational standpoint. What kind of changes has NERC ordered? What kinds of what do we need to do to get to because there are several I think there are some NERC standards that were put in place that are due to be put in place, not from Uri, but from a previous winter storm, that have to go into place by April 1st of 2023. So the Operating Reliability Working Group is currently working on those. What a rotational load shed. How do we feel about that? I think that's one of the issues, because there were, I think, 23 or 25 NERC recommendations that came out post Uri, and so they're working their way through those. And the way IRATF is set up, we have a member from the Operation Reliability Working Group on the task force. We have 1 or 2, maybe 3 SOG members, I don't recall offhand, on IRATF. And what's happened, they're the technical expertise for a lot of these. So some of these issues are getting referred to those working groups, and then they report back what they're working on. I happen to follow both of those working groups as part of my COG responsibilities. So I know that they're working on those, and they'll be coming back to IRATF with a lot of this information. So they're making headway. Some of the revision requests that we were approved this round of meetings, the behind the meter generation, the allowing deliverable capacity to be used for winter, the winter capacity obligation, those all, and the demand response all shore up the capacity for the winter season. So I think that they've tried, SPP has prioritized what needs to be done to provide the assurance for the 2022-2023 winter season. That became the prioritization for these 25 initiatives. We've tried to hit those first.
Thank you for that very holistic response, Sherry. There's a lot of information there. Thank you.
Okay.
I do think it would be helpful if somehow we can share this information publicly, because as we head into winter and like that steps have been taken to that we're in a better place now than we were 2 years ago as we head into winter. And while catastrophic events are more likely, we believe that we've shored up some areas here, and that we just are better off. I do think that the fact that they prioritized those 25 initiatives and didn't just go for the low-hanging fruit, but prioritize them and are working through them, and with the goal that half of them are done and we're still plowing through it. I think that's important to share. I think it's important to share with the governor and the legislature and the public to provide kind of a summary of what is going on at this level. And or SPP can come in and report to them, specifically the legislature. If you think about the small business people that were impacted throughout the state, as well as residents. But a lot of folks, this was it's something they just can't afford to go through again.
Right.
Sherry, but not to overly pick on you on this area, but I do have one more question.
Sure.
Let me going back to the NERC report. While it gave prospectively, and we hope their prognostications are correct, a pretty good marks to SPP for the upcoming winter season. It didn't give very good marks to MISO. This is our neighbor to the east, and I know that during Uri, we had to rely to some extent upon, there's an interreliance through the SEAMS process. Does the fact that MISO is at somewhat substantial risk, and it's pretty well detailed within that NERC report, does that tangentially create some kind of risk for SPP?
I would imagine that it probably does. I don't know what level of risk. I'm trying to recall. I know we've talked about in some of the SEAMS discussions, and JTIQ in particular, there have been conversations about increasing transfer capability and all of that. But as between the regions. But I'm not sure if one region is deficient, they're probably going to keep what they have within their footprint. So to the extent that they don't have the ability to assist like they did this during Uri, I suppose it does present some amount of risk. I don't know if that's being discussed. I have not heard that discussion within SPP work groups, but I suppose there is. I think SPP's, the way they look at it is we need to ensure that we have what we need to serve the needs within our footprint. And I know there's a big push to make sure that any excess capacity that we have isn't being sold out of the SPP footprint. So that we have the ability to rely on what we have. And I would guess that, to the extent SPP looks at it that way, MISO is probably looking at it the same way from their perspective. So, to that extent, there may be some risk there. I don't know how significant that risk is. I can't imagine that SPP is not taking that into consideration, but that's something that I'll have to follow up on, because I honestly do not know what, if anything, is being done or considered regarding that.
Very insightful. Thank you. Thank you, Sherry.
This is my last substantive slide. It's the JTIQ update. Here again, just to refresh your recollection, there are 5 projects that have been identified along the seams that has a total cost of just over $1 billion. And I don't think there's too much issue with the projects that have been identified, but now we're in the part that everybody's going to have some difference of opinion about, and that's the cost sharing arrangement. SPP and MISO have been educating members on both within MISO and SPP through various working groups. And the proposal that's coming forward is that there would be cost sharing between the generators and the load. And they've got a 90-10 split there. That has a basis in the fact that these projects are all over 300 kV. I think most of them are 345 kV projects. And in MISO, for those type projects, there's a 90-10 split between generation and load, on the belief that load does have some benefit from that generation interconnection. So that's what they're proposing for that piece. They're also proposing cost sharing between SPP and MISO loads. And based on the calculations that they've made, based on the proportion of total adjusted production costs, benefits for each RTO, my SPP would bear $71 million in costs, and MISO would bear $29 million in costs. So then what the last bullet basically reflects that, okay, so as to the SPP load portion, how are we going to cost allocate that? Is it going to be a regional cost allocation? That's what's proposed by SPP staff. It's subject to RSC approval. We will be receiving information at COG about a breakdown on kind of the zonal benefits. I believe there are COG members that are probably divided on this issue. Some, I think, are going to lean towards a zonal benefits approach and won't want to have these costs peanut buttered across the region. But most of the projects, whether they're interregional FERC Order 1000 or non-FERC Order 1000, or whether they're interregional projects, are currently, there's a cost allocation methodology for those in the SPP tariff that allows them to be regionalized. So there are going to be COG members that are supportive of that region-wide cost allocation, and probably COG members who are opposed. So we'll see how that shakes out, but we'll get more information in our December COG meeting. And I don't know that we'll be prepared to take a vote in December, but I imagine we'll be voting on these issues in January. And that's my final slide.
What's the time frame of the 5 seams issues and projects rather?
Well, they're not going anywhere until there's a cost allocation
Right.
figured out, because there's gonna have to be tariff changes made to MISO and SPP tariffs. Of course, you know, the cost sharing could be affected by the DOE's recent announcement of the grid resilience and innovation project grants. So there's a lot that's sort of unknown right now.
Yeah, I'll just add, so this is a new study process, a new transmission planning process. So if it were part of one of our normal planning processes, we have cost allocation frameworks set up. Say if these projects were to come out of the generator interconnection study process, they get assigned to generators. If they come out of the ITP process, they get assigned using the highway byway method. Because this is a new study process, we don't have a method to assign these costs. And so that, as Sherry said, that's going to take some time to see if we can reach a consensus on how the cost should be allocated. And then the last thing she raised could be pretty major, which is, from what's been shared with us, that there is a possibility that these could qualify for some outside funding, which would potentially make those cost allocation discussions much easier. But I think that's pretty preliminary. So we're not counting on that yet, but that could be, months of process. So I don't think this is happening in the next month or two. I think this is going to be a longer term process.
It really seems to me that this meets DOE's, if you look at what they're looking for, that this exactly fits and satisfies, I think, the components of that energy grant.
And as I said, that's my last substantive slide. The last one is just the question slide, which we've kind of handled as we go, but as always, I'm happy to answer any additional questions that you have that this might have generated. And if you think about it and have a desire for more information later, and I will, Commissioner Keene, take a look at the MISO implications of that NERC report for SPP and try to figure out what, if anything, is being done.
Well, thank you very much, Sherry. Are there any further questions? Hearing none, I think we're at a conclusion here. Once again, wow, Sherry, you just can't hide your professionalism. I'm sorry, you just can't do it. And we're so grateful to you that you're willing to serve in this capacity as a work group consultant for us. It's very important to us. And I will be in touch with you. I know I have some follow-up questions I want to ask. And once again, thank you so much. We always look forward to these reports. They're most informative and very helpful.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry. All right. Here we are, we're back. Commissioners, I believe we're at a conclusion for those matters that were on our agenda for consideration today. Unless you have anything further that you would care to take up at this time, I would entertain a motion that we adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye, motion carries. We're adjourned. Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye-bye.